Well, howdy. Um, we're going to look at a very interesting question about violence. I love questions like this because it's just a big question that like we're oftentimes just kind of dismiss in our minds, and then a lot of people just kind of come to their own conclusions, and so sometimes we just accept what other people say or think about something without actually thinking about it ourselves. And I love questions like that. Now, this isn't going to be a ending to the conversation. It's a launch to the conversation. This is something that has to be returned to later because it has different applications where something is right versus with it being wrong. Just like with sex, in Christian teaching, sex is not wrong. Rather, how it is used and with who it is involved is the issue. So, okay, uh, in Western culture, Western society, it's kind of deemed that violence is inherently bad and wicked. It's always wrong. Violence is never the answer. It's always wrong. That's not exactly true, and it's definitely not biblical. Now you might say, "Oh, well, the Bible is just a bloodthirsty book." Well, now hold on. Let's look at this. Okay, the idea is I see a lot of people saying something like this, like they'll watch movies or play video games and they'll say, okay, if it's wicked to show nudity or to hear language, then violence is just as bad. And I understand what they're saying, but not quite, not quite. Paul uses some kind of questionable language, especially like in the book of Galatians. He uses kind of a word that's kind of like that people are still debating about. And nudity really isn't necessarily a bad issue. It's just, once again, the context of nudity. There's nothing inherently evil with nudity or with sex or anything like that. Once again, it's just the context, how it is used, that kind of stuff. So with that being said, it's more about whether we're using our speech to build people up and whether it's guarded, whether it's wise. There's a lot of different things like that. So now let's take that over to the whole thing about violence. Well, once again, it really depends the context of the violence. And so, okay, I find it very ironic personally that violence is like, oh no, that's violence is never the answer, because as we've seen in the societal issues around us, the problems in the culture around us, violence has been deemed by many as a viable option. I mean, not everybody agrees. For instance, there's a lot of people going back and forth on this, but violence has been deemed by a large group of people, validated by many people on different news things and news outlets, and by many politicians, that it's okay in the case of, for instance, rioting or trying to get justice, that kind of stuff. So, okay, this is, once I'm not condoning or condemning, that's not even the issue. The issue is, here we're looking at, is violence always immoral and inherently evil? Well, this is just a perfect example of people saying, the Bible is violent, God, there is no God, or God isn't powerful, or God isn't whatever. And it's like, well, now hold on. Now you're living by a double standard. You're saying God can't do this, but it's okay and moral for me to do this, in order to bring about justice. See, basically the means justify, the ends justify the means. It's okay that we're doing, the different rights and that kind of stuff because we're fighting for a good outcome. Okay, so maybe once again, this is something that we should stop having multiple standards. I heard Ravi Zacharias talking about this with multiple standards. He says, okay, I was asked a question about whether it was immoral to be in this certain kind of relationship, and I said, this is Ravi talking. He said, I said, this is a conversation that cannot be adequately resolved because who is the standard? Is it God? Is it you? Or is it society? Because what's happening is you're saying that you have to live by, that I have to live by your standard, but you have to live by your standard. So, not everybody's being held to the same standard. And so there's no way I can possibly I can possibly resolve this conflict, and we can work out an intelligent conversation between the two of us, actually sharing ideas and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, the exact same kind of idea is definitely present in this conversation. We're saying, okay, God has to act not good, not perfect. He has to act how I deem good. Okay? And then, because I am imputing value of what is good and what is not good. And so God has to measure up to this standard. However, I don't have to measure up to that standard. This is just a hypothetical scale about if good ever did exist that he has to stand by, but I don't have to stand by. And that's where the big issue is that morality, the idea of good and bad, comes from God. If it doesn't, then there's no reason why you should have to follow it. And we can all agree that there is an absolute standard of right and wrong just by a very simple question. Is it right and good and moral to have sex with children? Well, nobody who isn't amoral is going to say, hey, yes, this is a good thing. I mean, our conscience tells us, no, that's a terrible idea. Science shows us that's a terrible idea. I mean, there's just so many different things that show, tradition, all these different things that, no, that's a bad idea. And so there's kind of this double standard of is violence inherently evil or not? So let's keep looking at this, okay? There's, what am I saying? The Bible and Christianity are definitely held to a standard separate from every other standard and demanded to be better than perfect. And you see the same thing happen in the claims of whether the Bible is historical or not. So Egypt's sources don't have to follow these rules. Babylon's sources don't have to follow these rules, but the Bible has to follow these rules. I can go to the Bible instantly assuming that it's wrong about everything, but then I can go to these other sources and believe that it's just right about everything. I mean, there's definitely this you have to treat the Bible as historically minimalist, but then you have to treat, this Pharaoh's writings as historical maximalist. It's like, that doesn't really fit. So why does the Bible have such graphic content? Some people have kind of brought up, and I think John Piper had a great lesson on this. I was listening to his podcast the other day, but there's only one really thing I want to highlight from it. He said this, because people are violent, and I think that's absolutely true. We have this standard that doesn't apply to anything else, ourselves, or any other literature that we hold the Bible to. That's not it's not a scale of what's good and perfect. It's a hypothetical scale that I don't think I or any other book should, or any other thing, or even whatever should have to follow. And it's not necessarily of what is good and what is bad, what is right and what's wrong. It's just simply my hypothetical scale. Like, for instance, God has to be completely peaceful, and he could never, ever, ever bring a disease or anything like that on people. That just couldn't happen for him to be good. Well, says who? Well, it says my own imagination. It's like, and what do you base that off of? So we've created this kind of hypothetical scale of right and wrong, and we've just said, hey, philosophy be thrown out into the wind, and it's just, this is just my made up idea without anybody's input whatsoever. And if you disagree with me, you're evil, and God's not real. And it's like, well, that's not really an intelligent conversation. You can't really move on from there. There has to be a basis. Why would it be wrong for God to bring disaster on people? Because he could never do what was wrong. What if he told them, don't do that. If you do that, I'm going to bring disaster on you. And then they did it anyways, and so there's no consequences for their actions? So justice doesn't really exist, and God doesn't really care about right and wrong? See what I mean? There's a lot of times that people will come to their own conclusions, and then they won't see that it's a double-edged sword, and they will tweak philosophy to kind of comfort their own views and kind of just come to their own conclusion and then say, no, this is the way it is, even though it's not based on reality or fact or truth. It's just based on this, once again, this hypothetical scale. So, the Bible has violence in it because people are violent. And so then that brings us to a series of quandaries, inquiries here that we could think about here. Do we want the Bible to be unrelatable and mythical? It shouldn't have any violence in it. Well, I mean, people are violent, so you want it to be something that we can't connect with? Haven't you ever just hated somebody? Haven't you ever gone through something that just caused you absolute despair and you've been betrayed by people and nobody knows how you feel like? Everybody's turned against you. Everybody thinks that you were the person in the wrong when you weren't because somebody else was lying about you. These kinds of things. These are the real world. If the Bible was written to a hypothetical dreamland where nothing bad ever happened, well, then yeah, I bet it wouldn't have things like violence in it. However, people are violent, so it kind of has to address what's actually there. Or maybe God should have used perfect people who never made any mistakes. Well, what can we possibly learn from that? See, Jesus was perfect because he was God. People are not perfect, and we definitely are not God. We never will be God, and so we have to learn. God doesn't have to learn. He's so we're talking about different like qualitatively different things. Okay, so or maybe we think that the Bible should give us lessons that we ourselves aren't even good enough to learn from. No matter how you look at these questions, it's something that it's a problem that you can't get away from. So that takes us to the Ten Commandments, where it says, "Hey, don't kill people. Don't. Well, I should reword that. Don't murder people." And you might say, "Well, murder is killing." Actually, no, it's not. It's not. That's once again one of these things that we're told to believe that really isn't true. Murder and death are many very different things. Okay, first off, everybody is subject to death. God said that when, the whole Garden of Eden thing, he said, okay, if you do that, there's going to be death. It's not going to be good. You won't be allowed to eat from the tree of life. And Adam and Eve did it anyways, and so there is still that going on there. Animals die. Okay? Now there's justified deaths, where something is... here's an example. Somebody kills 4 people. What should the punishment be? Well, he took life. So in the law of God, his life should be taken because he spilt blood. He has created an injustice that has to be rectified because we were made in the image of God, which means we have to stand firm on morality. We have to stand firm on morality in the world. The problem is that people oftentimes go to kind of extremes. Like, I'll stand firm on justice, and then it turns into a revenge game. And we overlook the other aspects of God that we need to be instilling in issues. Peacemaking, correcting in love, patience, mercy, all these different things. And it's like, well, let's forego all that and just focus on bringing justice in the world. And it's like, well, kind of a mixed bag there. So the Ten Commandments say, hey, don't murder, but this is different than don't kill, okay? Because the law says that some killing is justified. If this person does this, kill them. Now, I'm not going to look at the reasons for death at this time. We'll talk about that in another video. The idea here simply is violence immoral. And there's one thing that I've noticed a lot of times with people who ask these kinds of hard questions is they go and whenever we're addressing this one issue, and answering this one question, they try and turn the conversation to another one and try to make you answer 5 different things. And if you try to answer them one at a time, they say, oh, so the Bible isn't true. Just like I said, God doesn't exist and you don't know. And it's like, okay, let's calm down there. So let's stay focused here. This is not a one-stop, I said this at the beginning of the video, this is not a one-stop video that we're just going to talk about everything to do with morality, everything to do with the law, explaining everything, explaining God's character. We're not talking about all of that. We're just talking about the existence of violence within the framework, okay, of the Bible. Well, morality, I guess you could say. We'll extend it out to morality. So, okay, so some killings are justified by that same law that said, thou shalt not murder, okay? And then that brings us to another issue, that Israel was itself commanded to march out into war. Now, once again, the issue of the genocide, as it is oftentimes called, that's not something we're going to talk about today. I'm just kind of referencing that. So, that same law that said "Thou shalt not murder" said, "Hey, if somebody does this, kill them." And then it also said, "Hey, go and kill these people." So there is definitely a difference there, and I think that should be kind of emphasized, because a lot of times people do this with pacifism. I believe in pacifism. I believe that there's no reason for violence, and so therefore I'm going to take all the verses that have to do with not fighting, and I'm just going to say that they apply in every single situation. And then the ones that don't teach pacifism, I'm either going to say that the law is outdated, that it doesn't make sense, I've segmented the Bible according to my beliefs of what I can profit from and what I can't profit from. And that's all it comes down to. And so you have this book that's been picked apart with morality that doesn't really even seem to make sense. So that brings us back to the question, is violence immoral? Not always. Violence is not always immoral. This is just a fact of life. Okay? Sometimes no violence is immoral. So somebody abuses their authority and unjustly kills somebody else. Should they be held accountable? A boy rapes a girl. Should he be held accountable? And by what standard? These are important questions. These are very big important questions, and I feel like a lot of times we're too busy talking and affirming our own beliefs that we already believe, that we don't stop for long enough to just think about it. Oh no, I don't need to think about it. I already know I'm the world's smartest person. Everybody else is just a complete idiot. Well, you're not going to be able to go very far in life. Let me just stop you right there. You already know that all there is to do it. Why are you even watching videos? I mean, clearly, the whole world is in awe of your extreme knowledge. And I mean, honestly, if you go to any kind of a situation with the idea that I can't learn anything, well, then guess what? You're not going to learn anything, because you're going to blind yourself from your own short sights. And everybody has blind spots. Everybody. So violence is not always immoral. Sometimes no violence is immoral. The Bible never actually teaches pacifism, and this is something that a lot of people just don't get. There are some schools of thought within Christianity that teach pacifism. No war, no fighting, no anything. Okay, that's not actually a biblical idea. Now, that takes us into Jesus' teachings and how they should be understood and how they relate to the Old Testament. Those are beyond what we are talking about today. But remember, the law was given in part to show people sin. If violence was wrong, always, under every circumstance, well, then God would have been telling Israel to commit sin so that they could not commit sin. See, when you think about it, that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That means I must be wrong with the view that I have on this, because philosophically, this is a clusterfuck. I mean, it implodes on itself. It's not a sustainable view. Pacifism really never is a sustainable view. Let's say, for instance, your kid is being beat up by somebody. What are you going to do? You're just going to stand there? No, you're going to do something to break it up. Well, what if they start fighting and start hitting against you? So I mean, pacifism is unsustainable. It's unsustainable in practice and philosophy. It's just not something that can be sustained, held on to, validated. So when you try and take Jesus' teachings and try to say that he's a pacifist, or he's a socialist, or he's a Democrat, you're always going to come short of that, because Jesus doesn't fit into those boxes. Those are our nice little boxes that we like to live by, and we like to make data easier to compute. But reality doesn't really oftentimes look like those boxes. This is why it's important to kind of get off the internet and just go talk to real people in real life, because you start to see things in a different way. So let's go back to this. Violence is not always immoral. The Bible teaches many different things. In one part, it'll say, like, for instance, okay, turn the other cheek. But then on another thing, it'll say, hey, stand for justice in this. And it's like, but how can I stand for justice if I'm turning the other cheek? You see people get really confused about forgiveness. Forgiveness cannot exist where there is no repentance. You cannot restore somebody who does not want to be restored. You cannot make a decision for somebody. These are things that are taught throughout the Bible, but we like to just kind of push aside anything really that contradicts the way that I want to think about this, and then we surround ourselves with people who will validate my idea. So I'm not going to listen to you or you or you or you, which is why it's very important if you're going to have an opinion about anything at all. Make sure to actually listen to other people's counterpoints. You don't have to agree with them. Rebuttal them if they are wrong. But however, and I'm not saying that there is no right and wrong. Relative truth is just nonsense. Truth is truth, or it's not truth at all. However, sometimes we think that our view is equal with absolute truth, and that's not the case. Okay, so that brings us to interesting questions and quandaries. Does Jesus contradict the prophets? Does Jesus contradict the character of God? Does Jesus contradict the idea of morality? And once again, let's go back to the law and say, so the law, in showing us what is right and wrong, demanded us to do what is wrong for the sake of what is right? What? That doesn't make sense. So we're left with this very imbalanced Jesus, a very imbalanced Bible, a very imbalanced God, and all because we're trying to say that the Bible teaches pacifism when it doesn't. And so these are definitely things that need to be thought of. But with that being said, it is important to remember things like Proverbs, where it gives us a warning: trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. Don't think that you are the fountain of all knowledge. So Jesus gave balance to issues. He corrected issues of the heart. He talked about different aspects than the law talked about, and then some aspects of the law he kind of clarified. Some things in the law were just kind of lost to time, like where it says, repay the evil a tooth for a tooth. Not repay the evil, but the crime that was done, I forget how it's worded, but in the law it talks about how, when somebody does something, repay them to that extent. And see, that got to be like a thing of, oh, you've done wrong to me, now vengeance. And how it was meant was more of, don't, in your attempt at bringing justice, don't give more of a lashing than what was actually deserved. For instance, your child spills their milk. You take them outside and chop off their hand. Whoa, a little bit overkill there. See what I mean? And it's a lot of times you see people doing the exact same thing. This demands death, but then this other thing, that's not a big deal. It's okay if I cheat because, my wife didn't give me as much sex as I wanted to anyways. Even though I took that oath before God and before my wife and before myself, I am going to be dishonorable. And it's totally okay. It doesn't matter. She can provide for herself, and I'll just live my own life. But then this other thing over here, that's worthy of death. And it's like, well, that's something. That is an idea. So, let's see, where are we at here? Oftentimes, part of the lesson is learned in the Bible, but then the rest of the lesson is just kind of left off. So we have like half-learned lessons. Like, for instance, there's one part in the Gospels where Jesus says, go only to Israel. And there's another part in the Gospels where he says, go to all nations. If you're not paying attention to the context, it's going to sound like either a contradiction, or you're not going to pay attention to one part and you're just going to favor the other part, really for no reason other than this is what I want to believe. So there's a lot of issues there. If we have decided that no violence is the answer always, it's always the answer to have no violence, then the Bible is going to be very confusing, and God will be guilty of sin. See, because what we have done is we've become the master of God and of the Bible, and we've invented our own standard of what we think is right and wrong, based on our own life experiences, which is very short-lived, our very short, brief understanding of history, our environment that we live in, our culture, all these different, like, very, very temporary effects on our thinking and on our critical analysis skills, including our age. Your reasoning doesn't kick in fully until into your 20s. So we take all these temporary situations and our temporary existence, and we say, I am the source of all knowledge. I can perfectly ascertain what is true, what is right, what is good. And then God, who is always and has never changed, he doesn't know as much as I do when it comes to knowledge. Think about that. Well, I don't believe in God. Well, if you don't believe in God, then the point of morality is kind of a moot point. And there's no reason of even talking about the rest of it. See, what people want to do, once again, is they want to have this double standard. Oh, I don't believe in God, but I'm going to argue with you about how this standard doesn't make sense because of this. And then when I'm proven wrong, I'm just going to say, well, I don't believe in God. That's not a reasonable argument. You have to bring your whole brain to a conversation, not simply your brain up to the point where it agrees with what you already believe. That's not even really thinking. And there's just a lot of that going on. You don't know how many times I see people do this. It's like they're trolls, but it's who they are. That's really who they are. They're trolls on accident. Oh, well, I don't believe in God. Then I'm going to go on this video explaining about the law, explaining about the character of God, and rather than arguing on the basis of this conversation, I'm just going to revert and keep going back and forth between whatever gives me the high ground in the argument rather than whatever the philosophical conclusion is, whatever the scientific conclusion is, whatever the religious conclusion is. That doesn't matter. Just whatever gives me the biggest high ground. So then we say that we don't believe in God when it's convenient for us, but then when it isn't convenient for us, we say, oh, well, I believe this in the argument. And it's like, well, sometimes I think that people are so focused on winning an argument that they don't actually ever stop and just think about what they're believing. Just think about it. There's a lot of things in science that are just ridiculous to believe in, and yet there's still, a surprising amount of people who believe in it. And it's like, well, let's just stop for a minute and think about that. It's like, for instance, you will never convince somebody who believes in a flat Earth that the Earth is round. I mean, I don't know how to do it. They come up with these just wild things out there, and then like they don't really take into consideration all the schools of science, but then they say, oh, well, this one thing. And like, here's a good example of what I'm trying to be kind of obscure about, is I was watching this guy talking about how we know that the Earth is flat. He took, let's see if I can even remember how he did it. He took his hand, and he was pouring water on his hand, and he said, this proves that the Earth is flat because the water fell down. Or, man, I wish I could remember. I just remember watching his video, and I was thinking, wow, that was something. And anyways, so I'm sure you see what I'm getting at. Anyways, so if we have already decided in our minds that violence is never the answer, well then that's not really based off anything of what I want to believe. So why is violence never the answer? Because I said so. See, it's not based on anything. Well, I just don't feel good about it. So your feelings are the standard of absolute truth? It's great that you know and that you acknowledge your feelings, you feel things. These are all great. But remember that our feelings are not always the end-all, see-all. There was a big push for homosexuality a couple years ago. People were saying, hey, love is love. And I made the statement, well, that's not really a good basis for what is a moral thing and what is an immoral thing. I mean, if you think about it, you could justify anything by that statement, love is love. You could say, hey, it's okay if me and my pet are having sex. It's okay if I'm having sex with my kids. It's okay if I'm, that's just not a really good standard for really anything. And oh, you're homophobe, you're just self-righteous and all these things. And I said, well, I really didn't mean that. Okay, all right, I didn't mean it like that. If this is our conversation, obviously isn't going anywhere. And now here we are, just a few short years later, and everybody's saying, save the children, kill anybody who's even remotely might have had done something, maybe. And it's like, well, hold on, guys, what happened to the whole love is love thing? Now, obviously, I'm not advocating that, but I'm saying there was that contradiction in philosophy. See, it's okay, love is love when it's validating this, but when it's validating this, well, then love is not love. Well, so that takes us to the issue of what is the standard? Well, I thought my feelings were the standard. Well, if my feelings are the standard, then that pedophile's feelings should be his standard. Or do you want him to subject himself to your feelings while you yourself don't submit yourself to someone else's feelings? Why is your feeling the absolute standard, but his feeling is not? It's very alarming to me that justifying pedophilia and that kind of things is actually on the up. It's on the rise. Like that movie Cuties that came out. That Netflix is even still like trying to argue that. Now I know Netflix has always tried to push for, non-traditional relationships and transgender and all that stuff. I get that. That's their push. It's on a lot of their shows. Okay, I understood that, but I'm very surprised. Most people who push for things like transgender and homosexuality and stuff like that, there's this invisible line in their own head that they say, okay, so these things are right, but obviously that's wrong. But Netflix is like, no, we're gonna keep doing this even though it's obviously wrong. And it's like, oh, well, we're teaching that it's wrong to do this. What? By doing it? Okay, I'm gonna go out and rape some girls, but hey, I'm doing it to show you that you shouldn't rape girls. Like, what? What? Anyways, so my feelings have become the standard instead of what God says. Well, what happens if my feelings change? Does that mean that the standard has changed? What if, roll with me on this, what if when I'm 20, I have emotional feelings? Now, I don't, and I'm not 20, so don't take this anywhere, okay? This is just an example. Let's say I'm 20 and I have massive feelings for a 10-year-old. We would call that pedophilia, we would call that gross, we would call that child exploitation. There are just so many different things that's just wrong with that. So, okay. But now let's say the next year, I suddenly don't have any feelings for that 10-year-old. My feelings have changed.